switch on so I can see what's happening. Welcome to this ISEG's hosted webinar. Today we are going to be talking about the findings from our evaluation of the North East of England pilot of the Gatsby Benchmarks of Good Career Guidance. We're going to focus on some of the findings we had about implementation and impacts. So today we're very lucky to be joined by several other people helping me present. So you're going to hear from Beth Jones first. She's the Head of Programmes, Career Programmes at the Gatsby Charitable Foundation. And then myself, I will describe the work that we've done and talk you through some of our findings. And then after that, Nikki Moore, who's our Senior Lecturer and CPD Lead at ISEGS. She's heavily involved in most of the project and the writing up, so she will talk you through some of her experiences and highlights. And then after Nikki, we'll be hearing from Matt Joyce, who's currently Regional Lead at North East Ambition, but during the pilot was a careers leader in one of the pilot schools. And he'll be joined by Ryan Gibson, who was the pilot lead during the pilot, but is now National Systems Leader for Careers at the Academy's Enterprise Trust. Okay, I'm just going to give you some instructions on using Blackboard Collaborate. The little purple button down at the bottom right hand side lets you access the chat and see who's in attendance. So you can use that, and then there is a button up here which I assume everyone else has because I'm on a different setting to you, which allows you to change your screen options. Other than that, you can mute and use your video by using the buttons at the bottom of the screen. It's fairly straightforward. I'm managing to use it, and I always think if I can manage, everyone will be okay. Okay, so questions today. If you've got questions for myself or any of the other presenters, or indeed for any of the other attendees here today, if you can type them in the group chat function, ISEG's team members will collate those questions and will address them all after everyone's spoken. If you want to address them to someone in particular, that's fine. If you just let us know who it is you'd like to answer the question. Okay, so first of all, we're going to hear from Beth Jones from the Gatsby Charitable Foundation. I'm hoping Beth can join us.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Hi there.
Hi there. I didn't know you were going to use that photo. Those were the days when we were allowed to leave the house. Fantastic. Do you want me to just say a few words now, or do you want me to change anything?
Yeah,
yeah,
great. Yeah.
So thank you for the opportunity just to say a few words before we get into the exciting detail of the research report. So as Jill introduced, my name is Beth Jones, that says on the slide, and you've probably all heard about the Gatsby Benchmarks, and I've been involved in our work on careers guidance since the setup of the North East pilot. And the Gatsby Benchmarks are one of our sort of lead programmes in our career guidance work, but the Gatsby Foundation as a whole is Lord Sainsbury's charitable foundation, and there are a whole host of different focuses, from neuroscience to public policy to the arts. And the work that we do around career guidance is centred in our education programmes. And our work on education is very much focused on strengthening science and engineering skills in the UK through technical education, technicians in the workforce, science and maths education and career guidance. But we're really focused on the whole career guidance system rather than just on science and engineering within that strand. And we really want to see that all young people have the information, advice and guidance they need to make decisions about the future. And the pandemic has really brought that into sharp focus about how important that is. And the work that John Holman and the ISEGS team did on producing the Good Career Guidance report, which led to the Gatsby Benchmarks, and then evaluating this North East pilot that we're going to hear about today, has really been at the heart of that work. And I just really want to take the opportunity to thank everyone that's been involved in this process about bringing that framework to life, particularly the team at Derby, the North East Local Enterprise Partnership, and of course all of the practitioners, the careers leaders, senior leaders, careers advisors that are involved in the pilot, and the efforts that they put in have led to huge amounts of change across England. And now with the benchmarks embedded in every school and college, with good careers leadership, increasing employer engagement. We're seeing kind of the impact on millions of young people across the country. And I think when we started the pilot, we didn't really envisage we'd have this scale of impact. And it's really exciting to see that the government's continuing to make that commitment to keep the benchmarks at the heart of career guidance in their recent FE white paper announcements. And Gatsby's continuing to work in this area, so the lessons that we're learning, we'll hear about today, are still feeding into our work. So we've got strong interest in labour market information, in parental engagement. There's some really interesting lessons from the practitioners in the North East that are still influencing that work. So I hope that everyone else will be interested in reading the extensive piece of work and hearing from Jim and the team about the lessons that we've learned from all of those involved. So I will stop there and spend, so we've got most time to hear about the results.
Okay, thank you very much, Beth. Okay, so briefly, these are the sorts of things I'm going to cover today. We'll just start with a brief history of the benchmarks and how they came into being, talk you through some of our methods that we use to collect the data, and then focus on the findings really. So what was benchmark achievement over time? How did schools and colleges go about doing this? And what impacts did that have? What were the difficulties, the challenges, what enabled the progress, and then draw some conclusions before moving on to our other presenters. Okay, so I'm sure that most of you are already familiar with this history, so very briefly, this really has come about because of the changes and the removal of responsibility for careers guidance from connections and local authorities being transferred over to schools and colleges, which would have been fine, I assume, if the schools and colleges had that knowledge and the skill base and the capacity to do this. But of course, all of those things weren't necessarily in place yet. So we ended up with provision that was described as patchy at best, with some key deficiencies in provision in schools, such as lack of engagement with employers, failure to use labour market information with their students, and poor quality of personal guidance as well. So Gatsby funded the international research to identify what good career guidance actually looked like, and in partnership with ISEGS, they developed the Good Career Guidance Report and the creation of the 8 benchmarks. And of course, since then, we've moved on with the career strategy in 2017 and the statutory guidance in 2018, which is suggesting that the Gatsby benchmark should already have been achieved by all schools and colleges, that schools and colleges publish their careers programme and their policies on their websites, that those are accessible to students and parents, that they work with the career hubs, that they have a nominated careers leader, and they maximise the number of encounters that every student has with employers every year. Okay, so the 8 Gatsby benchmarks then, watershed moment for career education and guidance in the UK. And we've got the Stable Careers programme in at number 1. Benchmark 2 is learning from career and labour market information. Benchmark 3 is addressing the needs of every student. Benchmark 4 is linking curriculum with careers. Benchmark 5 is encounters with employers and employees. Benchmark 6, experiences of workplaces. Benchmark 7, encounters with further and higher education. And Benchmark 8, personal guidance. So the pilot started in 2015 and ran until 2017, and ISEGS was commissioned to conduct the evaluation, which started in 2015 with some baseline measures and then progressed 2016, 17, 18 and finishing up in 2019. So it's been a very long but very interesting and rewarding process. Okay, so how did we go about conducting our evaluation? Well, a brief overview is that we collected lots of different kinds of data, including self-assessment audit data from schools and colleges. So they audited their benchmark provision using an audit tool collated by the pilot lead at the time. We conducted education provider visits, so we spent a day with every school and college involved in the pilot once a year. We also did stakeholder interviews every year, and some of those were with team members in the local LEP. Some of them were with pilot staff involved in sort of leading and organising the pilot. Some of them were with local employers in the region, and some of them with more national institutes such as the CEC. In addition, we also looked at individual learners and we assessed their career readiness using a psychometric, which I'll talk you through later on. We accessed attainment, attendance and destination data through national data sets such as the National Pupil Database. At the same time, we also collected some financial data about patterns of spending on the different benchmarks. I'm not going to cover that today because it's incredibly complex and the data was very, very difficult to get my hands on and really get my head around as well. So we'll leave that to one side. So that information was used for reporting, and there was an interim report and of course now the final report. Okay, so this gives you a little bit of a more detailed overview of the different data that we collected at each time point. In terms of the MPD, we'll focus most closely on the GCSE attainment data. That gave us the most interesting findings. But other things that we were able to look at were attendance and destination data as well. Okay, so one of the most interesting data collection exercises that we did was measuring student career readiness. I'll just spend a little bit of time talking you through this because the ISEGS team actually developed a tool specifically for measuring career readiness in students in this project, and it was a nationalised contextualised tool. So it was designed to be a valid and reliable measure of student career readiness, and they developed it using quite a robust process of survey design. Started with a literature review and conceptual development. Then they put together a list of items into a draft instrument. From there, they asked experts on the topic to review and revise the instrument, which they followed up with cognitive testing with students to ensure that the items made sense, were understandable and so forth. It was then reviewed again. Then they piloted it with students and conducted analysis and validation of the instrument using some statistical techniques. So that resulted in the student career readiness, which has 4 factors, if you like, which come together to create a total score of career readiness. And those 4 factors are career planning skills, transition skills, information and help seeking skills, and work readiness. Now, on top of that, the instrument also collects some information about student characteristics, and that includes information on gender, ethnicity, whether parents were first in family to go to university, if they had a part-time job, and some other information. But it also asked them to think about whether they can remember taking part in a range of different career guidance activities of the previous academic year, and those activities are associated with the 8 different benchmarks. So the survey was conducted each year of the pilot at the beginning of the autumn term. It was originally intended for learners in years 8, 11 and 13 or equivalent at college, but schools were given kind of discretion over how they disseminated that. Typically that was through a careers leader. So in practice what we ended up with was information data from students in all different year groups, but a vast amount of information which we'll see later on. Okay, so some information on the schools and colleges who took part. So of the 16 pilot education providers, there were 3 further education colleges, and those varied in size. One was small, one was medium, and one was massive. There were 13 secondary schools. 3 of those did not have a 6th form, 5 of them did, and 1 of them was a middle school. And there was also a pupil referral unit included in that. So the schools varied widely in the different local authorities that they sat in. They varied quite a lot in size or number of students on roll. They varied in their Ofsted ratings, so there were representatives from all 4 different Ofsted ratings. And there were differences in the number of pupils registered for pupil premium and in the number of pupils who had special educational needs and disabilities. Okay, so Yeah, this graph might be a little bit more difficult for you to interpret than when it's on a massive screen. However, let me talk you through some of the findings. So what was benchmark achievement over time? This graph here tells you the number of education providers who had achieved each of the 7 benchmarks across the different years. So the dark blue bars represent the number of education providers who had achieved each benchmark in 2015 and so on. So at the start of the pilot in 2015, 3 education providers had fully achieved 3 benchmarks. So that's not bad going as a baseline measure, but the majority of education providers hadn't fully achieved any of the 8 benchmarks. So that tells you something about the range of different provision that was available just in one area. However, by the end of the pilot in 2017, so within 2 years, 4 providers had fully achieved all 8 benchmarks. That's a monumental amount of progress. 6 education providers had fully achieved 7 benchmarks. The majority of providers increased the number of benchmarks being fully achieved by more than 3. At the end of the evaluation in 2019, 5 education providers had fully achieved all 8 benchmarks, and 10 education providers had fully achieved between 5 and 7 benchmarks. And that included schools with and without sixth forms, it included the colleges, and crucially, it also included the pupil referral unit. There was some slight movement backwards across some of the benchmarks between 2018 and 2019. And that reflected a couple of things, in part Ofsted visits and changes in priorities, but it also reflected changes in career leadership, and quite often a change in career leadership meant a new careers leader coming in and taking a different approach to evaluating or auditing progress, and perhaps being a little bit more stringent on some of the criteria and therefore downgrading provision. Okay, so the benchmarks most fully achieved by most education providers before the pilot began were benchmark 6, which is work experience, and benchmark 5, employers encounters with employers, and benchmark 8, that's personal guidance. By the end of the pilot in 2017, every single benchmark was fully achieved by at least 12 education providers, and benchmark 7 was fully achieved by 15, which is really interesting because that isn't necessarily what the national picture collected by the CEC shows. At the end of the evaluation, all 16 education providers had fully achieved benchmark 5, and 15 had fully achieved benchmarks 7 and 8. So interestingly, benchmarks 3 and 4 appear to have been the most difficult to fully achieve, and really I think that's because it's a whole school approach. So you need all of your teaching staff to be involved in fully achieving those. However, barriers to achieving the benchmarks primarily seem to be located in the microclimate of the school or the college. So for example, how they chose to allocate resources and structure staff, the number of learners enrolled, the number of school or college sites, the different values that schools and colleges held, and the different way in which they prioritised careers or did not, as well as much more broader factors such as the geographical location. So rural schools and colleges did find some of these things a bit more challenging. So I'm going to move on now to looking at benchmark 1 key findings. Education providers actually didn't find it that difficult to publish their career strategies and their programs and their policies. The most difficult aspect of benchmark 1 was really being able to capture feedback from parents and carers, and that was the primary reason for the benchmark not being fully achieved by all providers. So staffing structures varied across the different kinds of education providers according to the size of the school or the college and existing hierarchies. So there really wasn't a typical approach to organising careers work. It was incredibly varied and unique in each institute. In the primary structure of organising career leadership, there were 2 main approaches. The first was a senior member of staff, being SLT, who took strategic and operational control of career leadership. and they were given some administrative support, or a two career leaders model, which happened more frequently in colleges and larger schools, where you had one member of SLT with responsibility for the strategic elements of careers leadership, and then another careers leader who took operational control. One interesting feature for the largest college was that there was a move to a strategic group for career leadership, so they almost had a full committee for it rather than it just being the responsibility of one person, and that started happening in 2018-2019. Okay, so the key elements for implementing Benchmark 1 successfully were really strong SLT support. So if your SLT didn't really believe in and value careers guidance and really support their staff to do it, they just didn't make that much progress. This person had to be invested and work with networked governors and careers leaders, and they all had to work closely. From the students' perspective, in Benchmark 1, it was really important that their voices were heard. So, for example, earlier on, we talked to students about whether they were asked about what they wanted and what they thought. And quite often the answer was yes, but quite often they also produced the caveat that we are asked what we think, but we don't think they do anything about it. And that wasn't something that we heard later on in the evaluation. Okay, Benchmark 2, so career and labour market information. Really clear progress was made by all kinds of schools and colleges in improving the impartiality of career guidance and labour market information during the evaluation. Schools and colleges use a wide range of different sources of labour market information. Some of those were free and accessed from different stakeholder groups, such as the local enterprise partnership. Some of them were commercial digital packages that they paid for, but they varied widely. A typical approach was for the careers leader to collate this information and then bite-sized chunk it up into more manageable pieces and nuggets that were then sent out to students or parents or both and staff via a range of different approaches. Those included emails, newsletters, social media. It also included displays on notice boards. Most schools now have television screens around the building, so it would be promoted on that as well. There was a definite increase in the use of career and labour market information by teaching staff and also by career guidance activity deliverers, and that included employers coming in and specialist organisations, so that when they were running sessions that were designed to meet other benchmarks, they'd start using career and labour market information within their presentations, and teachers became much more adept at accessing that information and making use of that in their lessons as well. Towards the end of the evaluation, there was a slightly increased uptake of the use of alumni, which most schools and colleges had struggled a little bit with previously, partly because it was difficult to track alumni, but partly because it was also really difficult to collate, manage and organise that group of individuals and then do something meaningful with them. But that was definitely improving towards the end. And I think one of the schools has suggested that that was because they had better relationships with students that had left over the last 3 years, students that had been through these Gatsby Benchmark career programmes, and recognised the value of having that good career guidance. So they were keen to go back into their schools and colleges and share what they knew now with their peers and counterparts. Okay, Benchmark 3 key findings. So all education providers learned how to work in partnership with a range of specialist support organisations to help deliver this benchmark. This is definitely one that a careers leader couldn't do by themselves. So a careers leader for this one needed to work with SENCOs, so the coordinators of special educational needs students. They would also work with external agencies such as CAMS, but there were also often specialist support agencies that exist in the local authority or even out with that are designed or purposefully there to support young people at risk of becoming NEET. So careers leaders really worked with all these other support organisations, but also organisations that supported the gifted and talented students like the Brilliant Club. In challenging stereotypical thinking, all education providers tackled stereotypical thinking about female job roles, and they did that from very early on. But from 2018, we started hearing careers leaders telling us about, well, we also challenge stereotypical thinking about male job roles. So quite often they encouraged males to come in and present about healthcare roles, and encouraged females to come in and talk about STEM roles and engineering, that kind of thing. Okay, benchmark 4. This was probably one of the most difficult ones, and it did really require the careers leader, usually with support from SLT, to engage all the teaching staff. And some of them were quite hesitant about being able to do this in their subjects early on. Initially, some of the staff who were first able to do this really well, were the staff working in more kind of practical or vocational type subjects such as ICT and business. But we also spoke to teaching staff in history, French, English, who made excellent progress really early on. And not just talking about subject knowledge and how that would link to different careers, but talking about different skills. So the sorts of things that really helped teaching staff be able to do this effectively were strong and committed SLT and a really supportive, approachable and persuasive careers leader. So we often heard that careers leaders who really helped their staff do this had an open door policy. You could always go and ask them for help and so forth. And quite often careers leaders were key in making the posters. So some of the posters you can see on those slides, these are careers leaders using software in their own time to create amazing posters that really capture and inspire people. So the careers leaders were key, and what we did find was that when teachers were empowered to make those changes, they really did reap the rewards of more engaged learners in their classes. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Okay, implementation of benchmark 5. The key thing here was that education providers moved from working with whoever they already had contacts with, which sometimes went well, sometimes did not go so well, to planning strategically who they wanted to work with. And that was based on what their needs were regarding fulfillment of the 8 benchmarks. It was also based on the quality of the activities provided. And in latter stages, those activities and who they wanted to work with was based on targeting of specific groups of learners, and that was definitely a key phenomenon we noticed in 2019, a little bit in 2018 as well, was that there was an extreme amount of targeting and personalisation of career guidance for particular groups of students, and in some cases individual students. In meeting benchmark 5, careers leaders worked quite closely with enterprise coordinators from the LEP. They worked closely with enterprise advisors and their career lead governors. They were really important in shaping the provision to meet benchmark 5 and ensuring that those encounters were actually meaningful. Early in the evaluation, there were observations from both schools, colleges, and from employers that quite often activities, events, or encounters were not well coordinated. They lacked a clear purpose or aim, and they were delivered by people without the necessary skills to engage students. It's not everyone that's brave enough and competent enough to go into a classroom and engage 30 students and keep them interested and ensure that they actually learn something. I don't even know that I could do that. So that really changed. By 2019, schools and colleges talked about being highly strategic and being clear with providers of these activities, what they wanted, what the aim of the session was, how that should look, what should happen, where it would take place, and they had much tighter control over those sessions, much more input, which really supported those sessions and activities to be more engaging and more effective. The range of different activities that took place was absolutely immense. Group talks, assemblies, speed dating, career fairs, mentoring, mock interviews, business breakfasts, exit interviews, enterprise competitions, business game challenges, digital skill development program, employability skill development programs. And interestingly, in the last year, I heard from several schools and colleges who were working with employers to design real-world assignments from employers who had actual problems that they wanted the students to solve. And we heard about that happening in business and in ICT, and those were really interesting for the students and brought just a completely different level of learning for them. Okay, benchmark 6, work experience. Understandably, this benchmark was much easier for colleges to meet because they tend to have much better and stronger, more varied relationships with a wider range of employers. But all education providers found it challenging to ensure that work experience or placements was of a high quality and actually offered meaningful learning. In particular, schools and colleges in more rural locations were even more challenged because of a lack of easily accessible employers, and quite often students, they don't want to travel, so if there isn't anything in the immediate vicinity, it's really difficult to find them somewhere meaningful for them to go. In schools, learners were more often responsible for sourcing their own work experience, with more vulnerable learners being offered support in finding something appropriate. But that really required very careful matching of learner to employer, and that was often the case in colleges as well. Okay, typical practice in schools at least was to offer work experience as a block placement, usually a week in year 12, and some schools did this in year 10 as well. That really wasn't always practical because quite often students, younger students in particular, are neither prepared nor ready. As I've said, the students had to quite often find their own placements, but were not necessarily supported to find appropriate or high quality placements. And ensuring health and safety checks and insurance is both expensive and time consuming. So a couple of schools opted to do different things, one of which was purchasing access to a national programme for sixth form students, and that offered workplace visits, employer mentoring, work experience and master classes. And then I think 3 schools offered to do a World of Work week, and this for them worked much more effectively. So the block work placement week was substituted with a range of different activities. So we've got Kenton, Castleview Academy and Churchill Academy. They did, for example, divided the students into smaller groups, and they completed 3 days work experience at a local workplace, 1 day at a further education college and 1 day at a university. And that was much better controlled and much more effective. Okay. Benchmark 7, key findings. All education providers absolutely excelled in meeting this benchmark, particularly with HE institutes and for schools without sixth form FE as well. Both HE institutes and FE colleges were very keen to provide encounters in schools and colleges or host activities, workshops and whole day experiences. That was strongly facilitated by the fact that the National Collaborative Outreach Programme was being rolled out, I think it was 2017, 2018 and into 2019, and many of the schools in the pilot were eligible for quite a lot of funding, and they were able to use that for a range of fascinating workshops, medical marvels and all sorts of things. But essentially what it really did was help them with the most difficult element of this, which is the cost of travel. So if you want to take your students out to a university or a college, you have to transport them, and that's really expensive and really difficult for many schools to do. So that was probably one of their key challenges. Some of the work we saw later on, it was extreme targeting of students for specialised colleges and universities, going much further afield than the local colleges and universities, so going further than Newcastle, Sunderland, going down, looking at some of the more Oxbridge courses, looking up into Scotland as well. So there was quite a wide variation of work. It is interesting that they've made such good progress with that, and that hasn't been replicated across the rest of the country. And it did make me think about how much of that is because of the work that the pilot schools and colleges have done, and how much of that is because of the extra support that the top funding have brought them. Okay, so benchmark 8. So colleges all adopted a triage approach, but external and internal commissioned personal guidance both worked well, providing there were sufficient resources. One of the key findings here was that personal guidance advisors noted towards the end of the evaluation that when they did personal guidance, it was actually about personal guidance, and it wasn't about giving them careers education or information or advice sessions. And it had really changed the content, the nature, and the effectiveness. I also found that personal guidance advisors worked much more closely with careers leaders, and they were really made use of for a much wider range of things than personal guidance, which was brilliant. In schools, personal guidance was starting to be offered to learners in earlier years, such as years 8 to 10, to support with GCSE choices and support those who might face more barriers in attainment and engagement. Okay, so moving on quickly to the findings about impact on students. So career readiness, using the SCRI, we found delightedly that there was increased career readiness in non-matched samples year on year. So over the entire course of the evaluation, we collected responses from nearly 6,000 students from all different year groups, but most commonly year 8, year 10, year 12, as those are key decision-making and transition points. We found that there were significant increases from 2016 to 2017, 2017 to 2018, and 2018 to 2019. So overall, a huge increase in year 8 career readiness scores, year 10 career readiness scores, and year 12 career readiness scores. Within that sample, we also had approximately 150 students who had completed the SCRI twice, once in 2016 and once in 2018. And those longitudinal data points showed us that career readiness had increased from 52.8 points to 73.9 points over the 2 years, which was a 39% increase. So statistically speaking, the increases in career readiness, both in the cross-sectional sample and in the longitudinal sample, were highly statistically significant, really big increases. When we looked at the data in a bit more detail, we tried to work out, well, what was really causing the career readiness increases? Would that just have happened anyway? But what we found out using some statistical techniques was that career readiness, it wasn't related to gender or ethnicity, but it was predicted by year group, which I think you would expect, seeing as over time you'd hope that those career readiness scores would start to increase anyway. However, crucially, what we did find was that the key indicator was the number of activities that learners recalled taking part in. So it was the wide variety and the number of different things they did that was important. And that, of course, was determined by the number of benchmarks that that school or college had fully achieved. Okay, some other sources of information about impacts on students came from employers. So they gave us some amazing feedback on what the students looked like and how they handled themselves and how they talked to the employers. So employers believed there to be reduced numbers of NEETs, and they stated that there were increased levels of learner engagement with career-related learning activities. So when they came into school to do different things, the students were more engaged, they were more knowledgeable. As one employer said, they definitely have more nous. So they were impressed with the career plans that learners in pilot school providers had for themselves, and which were updated after every careers activity or event. So that's really good self-reflection, monitoring, and evaluation. Businesses reported that learners who had left school or college and were applying or starting in jobs with them were much more work ready. So we've got a nice quote here from the engagement manager at a large local employer, who talked about the fact that when students were asking her questions, the quality of those questions were much more sensible. They were much more focused on actual career development. Is this the job that you thought you would end up doing? Have you done any other jobs? what would you do differently at school? So a massive shift in how students entered those activities, what they took from them, and how ready they were to ask sensible questions in those activities. Okay, some of the most fantastic feedback I heard was directly from teaching staff. I'll let you read the one on screen, but some of the other ones that I heard were students are a lot more proactive. I have seen massive changes in attitudes and engagement with career planning, changes in self-referring to the careers advisor, and that was from an English teacher. A lot of the girls have been talking about the higher level degree through engineering, and they're really enthusiastic. Last week when I had them doing their applications for sixth form in college, they were all on the Nissan website wanting to see if there was anything out yet. So keen. PHSE teacher, ICT teacher told us, I've noticed a huge change and I'm really chuffed about this. We have girls in tech. So the last few years in computer science, we've had no girls. This year we have 5 and they're really keen and really interested. And I think that's because we've been doing trips to Hello World at Teesside University, which is aimed specifically at girls. And I could go on and on and on about changes in aspirations, changes in attitudes, changes in engagement in class, students going from not attending and failing to being engaged and asking questions, and so forth. Okay, so learner attainment, and I think this is probably the one thing that everyone was dying to find out about, was what did the NPD data say about attainment over time? Well, initially in 2016, it looked like GCSE attainment in particular of students in the pilot schools had actually increased significantly compared to a local comparison group of schools. Fantastic, we thought, that's great. Over the next 3 years, I spent a vast amount of time trying to actually access this data via the ONS. And when we eventually got hold of it and investigated, we discovered that in 2017, when educational reforms were implemented, GCSE attainment and indeed attainment at Key Stage 5 tanked significantly all the way across the country, which made me feel quite distressed, I'm not going to lie. However, it was a phenomenon across the country and not really related to the pilot schools, so nothing really that we could do about that. And it is very difficult to demonstrate changes, significant and large scale changes in attainment. What I was able to do was examine performance just in pilot schools and Key Stage 4 learners and look at whether there was a relationship between the number of benchmarks the school held and the number of GCSEs at A star to C, or as it is now 9 to 4, each student was able to achieve. We were obviously only able to do this with the pilot schools and not nationally because we didn't have access to the number of benchmarks that each of those other schools had. Interestingly, there was quite a strong relationship, which the strength of that relationship increased over time between the number of benchmarks the school held and GCSE attainment. So the greater the number of benchmarks held, the greater the number of high-level GCSEs was achieved per student. And that relationship was statistically significant even when you factored in gender and ethnicity, when you controlled for whether the student had SEND status or not, whether the student was eligible for free school meals, was looked after or not, and crucially when controlling for the school Ofsted rating. So the number of benchmarks that a school has, it looks like that is statistically significant in supporting students to gain greater attainment at Key Stage 4. Ideally, what I'd like to do now is look at how that works with all other students across England. So what's enabled all this progress and produced all these impacts? The benchmarks themselves, they're clear, they facilitate self-assessment, monitoring, review and development, and crucially they offer impact learner attainment. Can we see the statistics? Yes, they're available in the report. So they facilitate self-assessment, monitoring, review, development. They offered a shared language for all relevant stakeholders. So schools were talking the same language as employers and other stakeholders, which hadn't been in place before. The pilot facilitator was hugely important. Very good at coordinating and sharing and supporting and motivating. And this sort of role is now taken up by the career hubs leaders and the career hubs. Partnership working was absolutely essential. So you need the enterprise coordinators, the enterprise advisors, local employers, support organisations, personal guidance advisors, and other staff in your school to work with careers leaders to deliver that provision. Networking in the career hubs is essential. The creation of the careers leaders role was absolutely vital. And that person who's in that role is absolutely critical. The most successful careers leaders I saw were really highly skilled. They were hugely determined, very enthusiastic, and absolutely committed to ensuring that every single student got the best careers guidance possible. Those careers leaders were actually expert at planning, organising, monitoring, evaluating, persuading, negotiating, and networking. And those are not necessarily attributes that a teacher might hold naturally. Institutional leadership and infrastructures which conveyed the value and importance of achieving the benchmarks, who distributed accountability and were a lever for culture shift towards careers are who we are, careers are what we do, and every teacher is a careers teacher. That needs to be your mantra. The use of digital packages were really important because they help to support monitoring and evaluation, which is an incredibly time-consuming and deeply administrative role. They also offered lots of support for the different benchmarks, so they give you access to LMI, access to information about universities, FE centres, apprenticeships and so forth, but they're very expensive, which is why Compass Plus being developed by the CEC is really important, and that being rolled out will definitely help all schools and colleges. So finally, a stable careers programme is helpful because that can be used to help fulfil strategic aims in schools and colleges. It helps to begin careers education with younger students in years 7 and 8, and it takes a more strategic approach in the development of partnerships and relationships with other stakeholders. Every teacher is a careers teacher. It's so important. Okay, so some of the barriers and challenges, very briefly, you won't be surprised to hear. Time in the curriculum. They didn't necessarily always have time for that, but canny staff would build it into curriculum lessons. Money, the NCOP and the Hub Virtual Wallet funding did help, but a lack of money for travel was hugely challenging. Ofsted reviews forcing changes in priorities. For one school, being part of a 3-tier school system was problematic because students didn't arrive till year 9, and by that point they'd missed out on career guidance. Ensuring all learners had meaningful experiences of workplaces. Capturing destinations data, which was the key reason why one benchmark wasn't met. Engaging parents at a long-standing issue. The administrative elements of delivering a careers programme were sometimes overwhelming. Multiple and competing initiatives, so other careers activities going on, other challenges, other programmes. Evaluation, because the benchmarks don't necessarily tell you what you should be evaluating. What are the outcomes that you should be looking to measure in your different students in different years? And for colleges with larger cohorts, obviously that brings with it its whole own problem of trying to manage and afford to deliver quality guidance to thousands of students. Okay, so those are my conclusions, which I kind of talked through already, and because I've been talking now for some time, I am going to pass over to Nikki Moore, who's going to briefly describe her project highlights, and then we'll move on to Matt and Ryan for their pilot experiences.
Thanks, Jill. Thank you very much. I think I'd just like to start by explaining my involvement in the project. So I have been working around the Gatsby benchmarks now for many, many years. In fact, I would say they almost run through me like a stick of rock. In fact, I was involved in the project which developed the benchmarks in the first instance, and my involvement there was working with PricewaterhouseCoopers to develop the financial aspects of the report. But as somebody who has always been in my professional world around young people, schools and colleges, and all of the issues that are faced around career development, the opportunity to get involved in the pilot was really enticing, and I actually began as the first project manager for the project over the first 2 years. And Jill has asked me to provide some reflections on the project, some highlights. So I'm going to talk here about some of the wider impacts and some of the things that I observed during the project. So I said, that in the beginning, I was really quite excited about being involved in the project. And I felt at the time that it was going to be a really great opportunity to build relationships with a community of career leaders and their stakeholders. And when I use the word stakeholders, I mean young people, parents, employers, and other community actors as well. And it's not often that we get an opportunity to do that over such a long period of time and to really understand the things that were impacting on provision and how these things were going to be overcome. The other interesting thing about the project was that it allowed us to compare and contrast the issues faced by schools in a diverse range of communities. And for those of you that know the North East, you'll know that there's, Newcastle, a big city, there's some market towns, there are other cities like Durham, which are sizable communities, but there are also places like Berwick-upon-Tweed, which is a very isolated area. So there was quite a span of geographical and social kind of communities that we were working in, and to be able to look at that sort of contrast was again very enticing. Another thing was that really to be able to have the opportunity to work over 4 years and to monitor the changes that take place through a community of schools, again, that long-term aspect of the project was great. And for me as a practitioner as well, I was really intrigued by the idea that innovative practices were going to emerge as part of the project, and I was really fascinated to find out what they were. So needless to say, I wasn't disappointed in any way, shape or form, and there were a number of things that I found really fascinating during the project. So we were very privileged to talk to lots and lots of young people during the project, and it was great to hear about their aspirations for the future. But one of the things that really stuck out for me was the role that some community players play, such as music teachers and sports coaches. Young people were telling us that, they had often had conversations that were career related with these people. And, I hadn't fully appreciated, I think, just how important these folk are, and often go unrecognised when we're talking about how we support young people. Now, we have heard this already in this presentation, but really it was fascinating to me to see the change in curriculum staff in general across all of the pilot schools and colleges. So initially there was some sort of resignation to the fact that the school or college was going to be involved in another project, and that there was a sort of level of resignation, but very quickly that changed into interest and then became passion. And what was absolutely fantastic was to hear curriculum staff telling us back, well, we're all career teachers, every one of us, in this school, we all do careers work. It's all part of our job. And that was so refreshing. We were so pleased to see that. And again, that was a fascinating development throughout the project. One of the things I found super fascinating, actually, I sat and observed a business breakfast one day, and I watched young people stand up and talk to a room of employers. And, that in its own right was fantastic to see. But what I really understood there when I watched that was that the impact of good career guidance goes beyond the school gates and reaches out into communities. I'll reflect on that again in a minute, but the notion that everybody's involved in young people's futures really sort of stood out to me as something fascinating. And there was some fantastic practice, and I'm sorry I can't mention everybody's practice that I saw, but things like the emergence of this concept of career safaris was fascinating to me. So this was a way of engaging young people and their parents to explore new opportunities on their doorsteps. And this happened in communities which, you know, had a considerable change in the industrial landscape in those areas, and parents weren't always aware of some of the new things. So this idea of kind of guided walks and career safaris was absolutely magnificent and highly innovative. So thinking back to this long project, I've had a lot of time to think about the impact of good career guidance that goes beyond the statistics and findings of the research, and I just wanted to work through those. So the first thing I would say is that good career guidance unites communities. And it helps communities to drive forward a vision for the future, because in this project, it wasn't just about schools and colleges, it involved everybody, and everybody came together in lots of different ways, you know, thinking about skills, thinking about new employers, etc. in those communities. It involved everybody, and good career guidance has the power to unite all of these players. Good career guidance also creates an environment for reflection and continuous professional development. This was really clear from working with the team up in the Northeast. People came together, they shared good practice, they thought about what they were doing, which went well beyond thinking about answering the questions for Compass Plus, but you know, was a real engine for change, for reflection and continual professional development, and that has to be good for a community. I've spoken about creativity and innovation already. There were so many great ideas that came out of this project, and I know that the team have gone on and shared those with other schools in the area, but have also reached out beyond the region's boundaries, and a lot of those ideas you'll see in many of the Careers and Enterprise Company publications where examples have been used. Another thing that really was reinforced for me was that career guidance is a family affair. One of the things that talking about their own career aspirations changing as a result of some of the activities that they've been involved in with their children. And so career conversations were taking place in homes. It wasn't just about kids, it was a whole family business. And again, that was wonderful. And the other thing that I really reflected on, and it made me wonder as a sector how we can support this, was the role, that important role of community stakeholders, that we recognise their contribution to young people's career development, but also find ways of supporting them as well, because I'm not sure that, you know, that they're best supported to do this important work. And for me, that was an important learning point. So what I would say to finish is that it's been a fabulous project. I feel really privileged to have been involved in it. And certainly a lot of the things that I've learned I'll take forward in my own practice as a teacher on various programmes and into further research. So thank you for the opportunity, really. Back to you, Jill.
Thank you, Nikki. Okay, now I'm hoping that we have Ryan and Matt somewhere.
Yeah, you've definitely got me, Jill.
Excellent. How are we?
Yeah, very good. Thanks very much for the invite and chance to speak today.
Thank you very much for agreeing to come and be part of it.
Right, good afternoon, everyone. So, as I said, it's a sort of a two-parter this afternoon from myself and Ryan. I'm going to speak first from a sort of careers leader involved in the original pilot before Ryan speaks, and then I'm going to speak a little bit more from a sort of a Northeast ambition, my current role. Being part of the pilot was a hugely positive experience for myself and the school I worked in at the time, Harton Academy, and considering everything that has happened since, it was obviously a huge honour too. As I said today, initially I'm going to be speaking from a personal perspective relating to that former role as the Student Progression Manager at Harton, before speaking again a little later after Ryan in terms of my current role. First though, just a few sort of credentials. My background is a qualified careers advisor with over 15 years experience. Previously I've worked for Connections and South Tyneside Council before moving on what was my former role as Student Progression Manager at Harton Academy. Harton's a great school in South Tyneside, and one that I was very lucky to be employed at, especially considering the general state of CEIAG across England back in 2011, which is when I started my role with them. I still remember very vividly first reading the copy of the initial booklet which came from the Gatsby Foundation that landed on my desk, and which summarised the details of Sir John's research and the 8 benchmarks. As is so often the case with the very best ideas, it was very simple, very clear, concise, and it just made a huge amount of sense. So as a result, when I discovered that the North East had been chosen to be the pilot area for testing the benchmarks in action, it was a very simple decision to apply, and I was obviously delighted that we were successful. So in terms of my experience with the pilot, what sort of resonated most with me and what I liked and still like most about the benchmarks are that they provide that comprehensive framework to set up, to develop and to evolve a careers program without being prescriptive about how an individual school or college goes about doing this for their students. This means that there is that commonality across different schools and colleges without allowing for that sort of individuality, as each school and college is a unique place of study with different cohorts and different contexts, as well as capacity, time and resources, etc. The start of this process for us was very much to complete the initial audit. And this was exciting as it gave us a chance to obviously self-evaluate our current provision against the benchmarks. And whilst we were honest enough to know that what we were doing wasn't perfect, we were generally pretty happy with what was in our careers programme. So it was quite a shock when we completed it and found out that we were one of the schools involved who had got no full benchmarks at the start of the process. However, even in that moment, it was still a positive experience, as the audit enabled us to identify our very clear strengths, of which we had a good number, but it also provided us with the opportunity to focus on what we needed to do to improve. And it put a greater focus for us on ensuring that we were providing meaningful experiences and that they were for each and every young person. We used the audit and then ultimately an action plan to set ourselves some of the sort of easy short-term goals, but also it allowed us to plan longer-term goals, because we appreciated that a number of the benchmarks would need time and effort if we were to make progress and achieve them. And again, this is another huge benefit of the benchmarks for me as a careers leader at the time, because they do force you to think strategically and to constantly challenge yourself and question, if you have a new idea for the program, why are you doing it? What value does it add to the program, or what gap does it fill within the program, so that the careers program itself can continue to evolve and to develop? I want to stress I hugely benefited, as has been sort of mentioned by Jill today, from the support and constant challenge of Ryan and the team at the LEP, although I also appreciated that we had space to develop our program in our way and in our own time. I also really appreciated the community of practice that came from working with each of the other careers leaders involved in the pilot. The willingness to share, support and encourage each other was wonderful, and I know that collectively this ensured that we each made more progress than we would have done if we'd all been working in isolation. As a result, over the course of the 2 years as a school, we made significant progress against the benchmarks, and at the end of the 2 years had achieved 7 of them. If you're interested, benchmark 4 was my nemesis, although benchmark 3 was also pretty challenging. In terms of the impact on the school, there's no doubt that it raised the profile of careers, especially amongst SLT colleagues, and it very much started shifting the conversation, highlighting that a successful careers program can't just be one individual's responsibility, and that there needs to be a structure and a strategy in place, and that there needs to be a whole school or college approach. It also encouraged us to evaluate everything we did more and from a range of different perspectives, including obviously from young people themselves. And this was good because it meant that we were being led by the evidence. This process can be difficult and challenging, but genuinely, if you want to improve, it does need to happen. The pilot also taught me that there is a need for regional leadership in this work if it's to be successful. I think the LEP was chosen well for the role, and they're in a unique position as a regional organisation who is used to partnership working, has access to all of the the key local labour market information, as well as strong links to employers, further education and higher education providers and other stakeholders. And this collaborative approach is needed in an operational sense for individual careers leaders and their schools and colleges, but also at a more strategic level to drive this work forwards regionally. So in summary, for me, the pilot experience was transformational, although it was more evolutionary rather than revolutionary, especially when compared to some of the other schools in the pilot. However, I would say that this is because that's what worked for us, and that's what we needed to do in order to make our progress against the benchmarks. I'm genuinely proud of my involvement in the pilot and what it's led to, which is a massive positive change for careers education in England. And I'm delighted that this feeling is now comprehensively being backed up by the evidence that has come from this research conducted by the team at ISEX. So I'm handing you over now to Ryan, who will be doing the next part of this joint presentation.
Thanks, Matt, and good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Ryan Gibson. I had the honour and the privilege, really, of leading the Gatsby Benchmark pilot in the North East, and I was struck by Matt's introduction, really. He introduced himself as a student progression manager at Harton, but on his slide referred to himself as a career leader. And that just struck a chord with me in the sense that it reminds me that the careers landscape in 2015 was very different to what it is now. And maybe some of the things we take for granted today didn't necessarily exist back in 2015 when we embarked on the pilot. So if I reflect on that for a second, there was no common language of what good looked like in relation to world-class careers provision, and no common language that clearly articulated what schools and colleges needed to do to offer really good provision. That doesn't mean that there wasn't good practice, of course. There was pockets of fantastic practice. They just weren't brought together in one clearly accepted or fully adopted careers framework across schools and colleges. There was no term careers leader in schools or colleges. There were people leading careers provision, but there wasn't a clear articulation of the expectations of the role. And I remember when we first started the pilot, my first task was to identify the people who were responsible and could be the point of contact for careers in each of the pilot schools and colleges. And careers was often a lower priority in schools and colleges, not because it wasn't important, but because leaders had other pressures, other competing pressures that they had to focus on. There was no compass tool for measuring your progress. And there were no enterprise advisors. There was no national CEC network or resources. In fact, the CEC had just been initiated and was just launching its work around benchmark 5 and 6. There was little focus in schools on tracking student encounters, particularly careers encounters and the impacts of those. There was a focus on what was happening with pupil premium, but not necessarily on careers activity for students. External organisations and providers who offered services to schools and colleges, particularly around careers, did so without really being able to relate them to any kind of common framework, which made it difficult for schools and colleges to work out whether it was a quality offer, an offer that met their need, or the right offer for their students. There, of course, were no career hubs, no hub leaders, and no enterprise coordinators. And in fact, as we launched the pilot, the North East LEP was one of the first areas to appoint one of the very first enterprise coordinators in the country, Dennis Heaney, and I worked really closely with him to explore how having an enterprise coordinator could potentially enhance a school's and college's ability to achieve benchmark 5 and 6 in particular. If we think about the landscape of careers advice, it had been struggling for a little while since the demise of the Connection Service and that transfer of responsibility to schools and colleges. And LEPs didn't traditionally directly support schools or colleges either. So when we launched the pilot, we had two clear aims, and that was to embed the benchmarks in 16 schools and colleges in one very diverse region, the North East LEP region, and then to test those benchmarks in action, looking at the conditions, the support, the capacity needed by schools and colleges to make measurable and hopefully rapid progress towards the achievement of those benchmarks. And sitting beneath those two clear aims were four clear intentions. So to build capacity within and between the pilot schools to deliver the highest quality provision related to the benchmarks, to test the impact of the benchmarks on student outcomes, but also any changes in whole school or college culture across a range of settings. We wanted to identify the problems and the barriers that schools faced, and also the solutions and opportunities that they developed to overcome these. And the pilot really, in that sense, worked from the ground up. It was led by all of the 16 schools and colleges and the career leaders in those organisations. And ultimately, we wanted to create a sustainable and replicable approach that could be applied at scale right across England. And I think we've achieved that. Now, let me just share with you very briefly the journey, or some of the highlights of the journey of leading that pilot. And the first thing we noticed was that career leaders responded very positively to the benchmarks. They appreciated having a framework to work within. They appreciated the challenge of the benchmarks, and we created an audit document, and that was, I suppose you could see it as a forerunner to some of the elements of Compass today, based on self-evaluation, so giving real ownership to schools and colleges, using a process of self-evaluation that they were comfortable with, but allowing them to start to measure their strengths and identify their areas for development. The benchmarks were proving useful, and they were becoming valued. And one of the reasons they were becoming valued is once you'd established your starting points and your current position, and as Matt said, had the confidence to accept that you might have a really good offer, but you might not reach any of the benchmarks, you might not hit that world-class standard. We then created an action planning document and system, so that not only could you assess where you were, but you could plan how you were going to drive improvement in your school and college. So we were really encouraged by the positive reaction of those responsible for careers in the school or college. And what we were really delighted with was, no matter where your school or college was located, no matter its geographical context or the makeup of the student population or track record, the benchmarks worked in every context, and progress was made in every type of school. And we also worked with independent schools and special needs schools as well, beyond the remit of the pilot, just to test the implementation of these benchmarks. And again, very similar stats we're seeing. And we were really encouraged by the fact that career leaders wanted to come together. They wanted to share challenges, they wanted to share solutions, share ideas, and work together. And in 2017, once we concluded the formal part of the pilot, we opened up the pilot network to any school or college in the North East who was interested in attending our meetings, and we were overwhelmed with interest, something that the North East LEP team and many others have taken on and grown through the North East Ambition programme in the North East region. And I suppose you could see these network meetings as the forerunner really to what most people will recognise as career hubs today. What we were also really encouraged by, and I mentioned having one of the first enterprise coordinators, well, what we saw was feedback from employers who recognised that schools and colleges using the benchmarks were more open to connecting with employers. It was easier for employers to engage, and they could develop really positive relationships, impactful relationships with teachers, which meant that those teachers could open up a wider range of interactions with students, and students could really get a real understanding of the world of work and the potential of future careers. And so we were really encouraged that employers could see the difference that the benchmarks were making in practice. And that meant that employers and schools started to work together in different ways, in meaningful ways, and in some cases resurrecting really good practice that had existed in the past but had stopped for whatever reason. And so the pictures you see on the screen there are a group of physics teachers from across some of the pilot schools coming together to co-design a unit, but they're doing that co-creation using the context of a engineering company called Unipress. So you might see that as a forerunner for teacher externships. You might also recognize it in what Nikki said about the importance of CPD. And crucially, we could see a real difference on the ground in schools and colleges. So leaders were telling us that the benchmarks were transformative, that they were having a reach beyond careers, if you like. So in the quote I've shared with you on the screen, learners being really engaged in GCSE maths because of the content of the maths curriculum being aligned with how it's applied in the world of work. And also that we saw aspirations being raised, so breaking that cycle of low expectations, low aspirations, particularly in deprived areas. So leaders in schools were telling us that they were seeing real difference, not only in the practice of their staff, but also on the outcomes of their young people. And because of that, because it was so valued by schools and colleges, leaders started to integrate the approach into their whole school and college development plans and improvement plans and strategic plans. And that resulted, I think, in what Nikki was talking about around the pilot ultimately involved everyone. It involved everyone across the school and all of the schools or colleges partners. It united people in a common purpose and a common intent, and it helped to develop that shared intent and purpose, which could then be run through the networks and communities of practice that had been established. And I think for me, it's probably best summed up by a slide I regularly used from Castleview Enterprise Academy, and I hope Emma doesn't mind me using this. She said their provision, reflecting on the benchmarks, moved from ad hoc to strategic, add-on to embedded, and ultimately it resulted now in a whole academy approach. I know that's something the school have developed even further since the pilot. And we noticed a difference in the economy. So the Northeast LEP was driving this pilot forward. It was working with large numbers of schools and colleges beyond the pilot, sharing the learning, building the networks, building the community of practice. And the Social Mobility Commission noticed the work that we've been doing and said that it was transformative, that careers provision in the Northeast had gone from some of the worst to some of the best. It encouraged people to follow the example of the Northeast, but it also noted success in terms of reducing youth unemployment as well. So we built a model, if you like, of how LEPs can work closely with schools and colleges to drive forward the economic agenda. And I know Matt will say a little bit more about how the Northeast has gone on to build from the strong foundations of the benchmarks and say a bit about what that means today. Of course, our work culminated in a sense in a new national careers strategy framed centrally around the benchmarks, which we were obviously absolutely delighted with. And really, whilst I'm sharing perspectives on the pilot, the real people who drove it forward were the career leaders, the teachers, the head teachers and principals in the 16 schools and colleges. They drove many of the things that we maybe recognize today. They drove the audit, they drove the action plan, they drove CPD. They made a real difference not only in their schools and colleges but on the wider careers system as well. And I'll just finish by with a slide that I always finished on when I presented about the pilot, and it was, there's no single magic bullet for good career guidance. It's about doing a number of things identified in the benchmarks, doing them consistently, doing them well, and doing them for each and every student. And the reason I use that quote again today is that was very relevant in 2015. It's been incredibly relevant since, and it's equally relevant right now. And it's certainly in my current role at Academies Enterprise Trust where I lead on careers provision across a large number of schools, it is about focusing provision for each and every student. And on that note, I'll hand back to Matt to say a little bit about how the North East has taken this work on and what that looks like.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Excuse me. So, as I said, I'm just going to really now try to briefly go through how, from the original pilot, what we've developed as a North East Lab into North East Ambition. And just going to really start by saying it's very fair to say to all of us involved in the pilot that this work was transformational, and that as a LEP, the LEP was in a unique position to drive this forward further in the region. So as a result, CEIG has become a central part of our region's strategic economic plan through North East Ambition. What does this mean in practice? Well, as a LEP and as a region, before the DFE had formally included the benchmarks as a central part of the new strategy, we'd already made the decision to build on the success of the pilot in terms of structures and models and to scale it up so we could support all of the schools and colleges in the region to adopt, implement and achieve the benchmarks. And obviously Ryan mentioned that in one of his earlier slides. As I said, one of the greatest learnings from the pilot was that importance of developing an effective community of practice that gives leaders, career leaders, a chance to meet up, to network and to share best practice. And as a result, we've set up and deliver regional career leader network meetings. These obviously fulfill that role of enabling careers leaders to come together, but also give us an opportunity to target resources in a fair and consistent manner to support all of the schools and colleges. Pre-COVID, we had a regular number of about 140 individuals signing up to attend these events. And now, obviously, we've moved these online, but they remain incredibly popular. In addition, we've developed a North East Ambition website, which is 2 sections. One that hosts news stories, case studies, toolkits around benchmarks, as well as directory of resources and providers, all of which are designed for our career leaders, and another that is focused on trying to engage employers further in education. At a regional level, we also send out bulletins on a regular basis. This is a fortnightly newsletter which contains details of events and resources that, again, we think careers leaders might find useful. And we've got several different versions of this for different audiences. In addition, we were successful in securing 4 of the Careers and Enterprise Company funded career hubs, which were again set up as a result of the pilot because of that their ability to help foster positive collaboration between schools and colleges. 2 of these are focused on secondary schools, whilst the other 2, one is the only college hub in the country and another is focused on working with SEND provision. These career hubs again are smaller communities of practice led by a facilitator who, alongside our ECs, work with schools and colleges on an individual basis and collectively to support them with their work as they make progress against the benchmarks. And we've got 95 schools and colleges involved in these 4 hubs. But clearly we don't ignore the schools who are outside of the hubs, and in addition to that wider regional offer that I've talked about, we make sure we support them on a one-to-one basis. The guiding principle behind all of this work regionally, inside and outside of the hubs, is about making experiences meaningful, making them for each and every young person, and again ensuring that integrity of the benchmarks are upheld. However, we have also expanded our work to do other things. So firstly, working with partners including employers, we're delivering a project called Education Challenge, which aims to support school leaders, teachers and governors to help reduce the gap between the lowest and best performing schools and to better prepare a new generation of young people for the 21st century economy. We have a One Vision project, which is part of the DFE's commitment to improve education and boost productivity in the North East and Tees Valley. They've identified 5 main challenges, including one which states that too few young people find a pathway to a good career. So 28 schools in the region are participating in this project, 16 in the North East and 12 in Tees Valley. They have identified 30 pupils each, and we're involved in helping to coordinate an enhanced careers package for them. This is built on personal guidance and ensuring that the young people receive multiple opportunities to discuss their plans with a qualified advisor. But it also involves analysing the data created from these interviews almost immediately after we receive it, and then liaising with a range of employers, FE and HE providers to provide a more tailored support depending on the aspirations of the young people involved. And then finally, in response to the growing levels of research that indicate that children are making career limiting decisions before they even reach secondary education and have the chance to access good career guidance, we've adapted the benchmarks for a primary setting and are currently delivering a 2-year pilot co-funded with the EY Foundation to test these benchmarks in action across 70 North East primary schools. It's been a hugely rewarding experience and one that has also been so far very successful. We're planning on publishing our first year report very, very soon. And amongst its key findings, it's highlighted how careers leaders, similar to the original pilot, have benefited from having that comprehensive framework that allows them to identify strengths and areas for development, and also that it links directly to the work going on in secondary schools. Other key findings include that over 80% of the schools have now embedded career-related learning through their general curriculum, and over 90% are saying that they are doing more and for younger pupils, and the children themselves have also responded positively. And finally, we, like every other organisation, have been impacted and had to respond to COVID. For us, we've listened to our careers leaders, responded to their main concerns, which were focused around labour market information, concerns about transition and experiences of the workplace. So as a result, over the last year, we've provided many labour market updates to try to show what is or what is not happening in the economy. And we're looking to further develop other resources and utilise our excellent data hub. With regard to transition, we've developed a couple of pathway documents that were shared with schools and colleges, as well as through a social media campaign designed to engage with parents and carers. And we've delivered a Learn Live event funded by the Careers and Enterprise Company on the same topic. And finally, we've recently launched a new work experience framework, which is for use by businesses and schools and colleges and can be used virtually as part of a blended approach, as well as for physical work experience placements. Now, why have I mentioned all of this? Well, quite simply, none of this expansion work that is taking place in the North East, and which is so essential for our strategic aims for the region and for our young people, would have been possible without Sir John's initial research, without the leadership of Gatsby, as well as the LEP team in setting up and delivering the pilot. However, all of the hard work has paid off, and it is great to read the evaluation, to see the impact of the pilot, and to know comprehensively, thanks to this evaluation, that what has been developed since the pilot, both in the North East and also important nationally, is firmly based on evidence and does make a difference. This also means that we can have the confidence to go further in the future as we continue with our ambition to make a positive impact on the lives of each and every young person in the North East. So thanks very much for listening to both myself and Ryan this afternoon, and I'll hand back to Jill and the team.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was absolutely fascinating to hear it from your perspective. It's really interesting what you're saying about the feedback about the impact that the benchmarks and that the Gatsby Foundation have had. One of the most powerful quotes or conversations I had with a careers leader in one of my last fieldwork sessions, it just about removed me to tears, because she really was trying to impart to us that she really needed to say thank you to the Gatsby Foundation, to Sir John Holman, to Lord Sainsbury, because without that research, without the benchmarks, without the funding, without all the support that's followed on from that, they wouldn't have been able to support their students in the way that they did. She said, we're bettering the students' lives and post-school lives because of them. She said, I'm so grateful. I don't think they realise, because of the research and the benchmarks, the impact they have had on the most vulnerable and disadvantaged students in Sunderland. And that's a school that had reduced its NEET from 50% to 14% in something like 3 years. Absolutely amazing. So I think we can move on now to questions. I'm hoping that my colleague Hannah is around and has some of the questions that have been posted. I've been able to answer a couple, but I know I will have missed some that might be important while I was talking. Hannah?
Hi, yeah, there's quite a few around learner attainment. But there's also someone wanting to know about resources and techniques used for EAL and ESOL students to meet benchmarks.
Yeah, it wasn't something that I came across whilst I was collecting data. I don't know if Matt or Ryan has something perhaps to add there, or if there are perhaps resources with the CEC. I think that's something that we might have to investigate later and get back to you on. Other questions with respect to some of the statistics, they are quite detailed, and you can access them in the report. but we effectively used ANOVAs for most of the statistical work, and then chi-square where that wasn't appropriate, and then the multi-level modelling we used regression multi-level modelling to test that. It's detailed out in the report. Okay, so a question from Gordon. It's encouraging that there's evidence that schools became more strategic in engaging employers and employees. In general, how was this achieved? Was it by engaging particularly skilled employers, those were more skilled in communicating, or was it more about training employers who were already engaged to become more effective? From my perspective, I think it's the former. I think it was working with the benchmarks and being encouraged to evaluate, so paying more attention to thinking about what worked and why it worked and how it worked, working strategically with enterprise advisors, with enterprise coordinators, with the LEP, and working with larger organisations who have those more formal skill development workshops or have particular staff in their within their hierarchy whose role it is to actually engage with schools. I'm not sure about training employees. I think there was definitely an element where careers leaders or sometimes teachers later on were being quite directive with potential employers coming in to deliver activities, being quite prescriptive about what would and wouldn't work. So if it is the latter, who addressed the training needs, it would be the careers leader. Yeah. Okay, do we have any other questions?
I think all the ones on the chat have been answered in one way or another at the moment.
Thanks, that's fantastic. In that case, we can wrap up today's webinar. I'd like to thank you all for taking time out of your busy day to come and listen to what we had to say. Thank you so much to Nikki Moore, Matt Joyce, Ryan Gibson and Beth Jones for coming in to deliver their perspectives and their thoughts. And if you have any further questions, you can of course contact me, j.hanston@derby.ac.uk. Many of them might be picked up in the report, and other great sources of information on this topic are of course the CEC and your local career hubs. Okay, thank you very much everyone.